ამოხეთ ქალტერეგონ ფეთქა twin მაზრმა სივრცე გაჭრა შირმა მოიშორა და განსხეულდა მუდამ დუმდა დაგახუნდა ყველაფერი თვალებიდან მელანი მდის ვიღიმი და მაინც მხერი შენ არიცი რა გავიარე როგორი ანდაბინ ვარ არ მიცნობ და დალახსმეს ვიხედავ წინ რომ მივდივარ შენ არ ხარ ჩემი მტერი უბრალოდ გული მწყდება და მიჯერე ძაღლი ხებს ქარავანი არ ჩერდება მე არ ვცდილობ თავი შეგაცოდომე მებრალები როცა ღამით მარტო რჩები საკუთარ თავს ემალები და გეტყვი ჩემდე რატომ ხარობ ჩემში იმედი როცა მარტო დავჭი ავდექი და მივედი წავიღე სიტყვა სიყვარული და თან შევახე კარი
Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. I'm Sopo.
And I'm Brian.
I'm really excited today because I have a guest, Jessica Whyte, whose book I fell in love with. I think it's one of the best books on human rights and neoliberalism I have ever read. So I'm so happy that you're here with us, Jessica. Could you introduce yourself to us?
Sure, and thank you for having me on the show. I'm Jessica Whyte. I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of New South Wales, and I'm also an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. And my research largely is on human rights, humanitarianism, the way that moral ideas are put to work in international politics.
One of the best things that I've gotten from your book is that really, I think, first of all, I expected the book to be more about human rights, but actually I learned so much about neoliberalism in the fact that I've been reading and especially being on the left, like all we do is criticize neoliberalism and read countless books on it, observed the process, written about it. But I think like you gave me the clearest framework to understand it that I have gotten so far. And so maybe you can tell us how your main thesis of the book, which is much more sharper and more poignant critique than, say, Samuel Moyn, who we've had on this podcast about, he discusses about how human rights, the civil and political rights were pushed and not enough of the sort of social and economic part. And that was just, an effect of the way the sort of post-Soviet world was developed. But you are saying something even harsher in that sense, that you're saying it was never going to be social and economic rights that human rights was ever pushed, because neoliberals were able to take human rights and completely reformulate it to be against any kind of government intervention and only focus on the rights that the market found morally acceptable, to make sure the market was not intervened, right? Like something like sort of like morals. Human rights of the market is how I look at it. So maybe you can give us like the overall thesis of your book.
Sure, thank you. Well, look, I was really interested in the fact that various people had talked, including Sam Moyn and others, about the sort of historical coincidence of human rights and neoliberalism. The idea that in the late 20th century, we saw the rise of neoliberalism and the globalization of neoliberal ideas, policies, and institutions. And at the same time, we saw the development of strong norms of human rights that tended to supplant or displace older ways of thinking about emancipatory politics. And so I was interested in trying to understand this seeming historical coincidence and whether there was more to it than simply coincidence. So what I did is go back to the mid-20th century when, on the one hand, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, was being drafted. And on the other hand, the neoliberal Mont Pelerin Society was founded by Friedrich Hayek as a way to try to reinvent liberalism in the context of widespread norms of social democracy, economic planning, socialism, and of course, the Soviet Union. So what I discovered is that, in fact, rather than being at odds with each other, these two bodies of thinking and these two forms of liberal politics, in many senses, were deeply intertwined, and that, in fact, neoliberal thinkers had done significant amounts to pioneer the understanding of human rights that came to prominence decades later. So I looked at the way that they had framed ideas of humanity as justifying abandoning any obligations other than very thin obligations that could be realized in market exchanges across the world. Someone like Hayek said the market order is the only order that can embrace all of humanity. So therefore, if we want to think in terms of humanity, we have to think with the market rather than against it. And I looked at the way that they worked to frame human rights as protections of globally mobile investors and to re-entrench the norms that had really been central to the colonial era and the international division of labour of the colonial era in particular in a period of decolonisation. And then I guess the bit of my book that is particularly surprising to many people, and in some aspects to me also, was the extent to which human rights NGOs in a later period, in the sort of late 70s, 1980s onwards, embraced and drew on ideas that had been formulated by neoliberal thinkers over decades. And they did this in some cases very explicitly in alliance and working with some of those major neoliberal thinkers, and at other times much more sort of implicitly taking up ideas as though they were newly discovered, about the, say, the authoritarianism of third world socialism or totalitarianism defined as state intervention into the economy, these kind of ideas that had been staples of neoliberal thinking for decades that were taken up by human rights NGOs in the period of human rights ascendancy as progressive norms and shifted from a point where they were clearly ideas associated with the right to being conceived as progressive ideas.
I find it really interesting how the debates around NGOs and human rights now, initiated by the US right, how because the left has been so embedded with this neoliberal human rights, that in reality the left is now defending it against the right-wing attacks, though it's so obvious to me how, like, Elon Musk's Twitter is fascinating in the sense that he posts Milton Friedman, Hayek. He's telling you, like, we're trying to restructure the state according to more orthodox, like the original neoliberal ideas, and not this sort of post-90s neoliberalism that embraced this multiculturalism. And so instead of the critique of human rights in the way it has been formed and the dominant, hegemonic form from the left, you're really getting it from the right. And instead of, like, your book, I feel like should have been, probably selling like hotcakes and everyone should be embracing this. Instead, I see all the leftists trying to defend this neoliberal framework. And so even though the left has been the first critics, of neoliberalism, somehow is it like because they just don't know enough that they think it's a coincidence, or they think, like, because you talk about this, there are people who are trying to salvage human rights, but they're so marginalized in the whole framework. And so I instinctually felt always that the human rights framework was a bad framework to use, because I've always felt that this was, again, what we mostly got was individual rights. And so, well, thank you for helping me put together all these things that I have been thinking and feeling into a much more complex system of thought. But, like, what do you think about this current mood that's happening, and then the left being so defenseless, not even but they actually are trying to protect the neoliberal human rights?
Look, it's really interesting, and this moment is obviously very disorienting for many, many people, many of us, myself included. But I think that what you point to is a phenomenon that we're seeing in a whole range of different areas, where because the Trump administration is essentially retrenching American soft power, whether that's the defunding of US aid, or attacks on human rights NGOs, or the defunding of Fulbright scholarships, or a whole range of different areas. We are seeing a phenomenon where people associated with the left are rushing to the defense of what have previously been, in a sense, objects of critique. And I mean, in a way, there's a sort of a long story, which is of what happened between the period that my book is about, which in a way ends in the late 80s, although I have some sort of postscripts about the period in which I was writing, which was the second decade of the 2000s. So there's a question of what happened between then and now. And I think that it's two things. One of them is that I think that human rights NGOs did embrace some of the critiques that came from the left. We saw Amnesty International changing its mandate to be able to deal with social and economic rights. We saw human rights NGOs doing things that were not as narrowly circumscribed as sort of neoliberal human rights in the way that I would articulate. We saw even Philip Alston as the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme inequality in human rights, putting out a report on extreme inequality in the United States, for example. So some of these developments in the realm of human rights, as well as obviously human rights NGOs taking up the question of migration. And we've subsequently seen a real reaction from the right against the extent to which human rights NGOs have moved away somewhat from the vision of embrace of Western civilization, embrace of the hegemonic power of the United States, etc. So I think that there is this sort of whole period between when I finished the book and now, and certainly between the period that the book is concerned with and now, where there are so many different developments that have, in a sense, moved us away from the paradigm of neoliberal human rights and created this reaction from the right, where I think in the first Trump administration, we had an attempt from the right to reclaim the language of human rights. Pompeo's Commission of Unalienable Rights, which was meant to be about a sort of getting back to basics, civil and political rights, freedom of conscience, protection of Christians, etc. vision, which mapped on really quite neatly to the neoliberal vision of human rights that I trace in the book. But then you also, I think, more recently have had a sort of almost an abandonment of that terrain by the right and an attempt to actually just dissolve and dismantle the institutions of humane global governance.
A few years ago, I met someone who was working at Human Rights Watch in the US, and they were just telling me how there was fights within Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, between sort of the new guard and the old guard. But the interesting thing is a lot of the newer, younger people who are working in these NGOs in New York or somewhere in the US or DC were, I believe, influenced by sort of this Bernie Sanders moment of like, we don't even have health care. So by seeing this, they started pushing more for economic rights. But still, it's so, and because of this, actually, some of the changes happened because the staff itself started demanding it from these NGOs. But it's still so US centric. Like, if you didn't live in the US and if the Bernie Sanders moment didn't happen and if this didn't become so politicized, how it's so normal now in the US to be like, we don't have any healthcare, and everyone jokes like you have no healthcare there. I don't know if this would have happened so much, and still so dependent on the moods and the politics of the US. Even with some of the changes, I still find very generally more cosmetic. But even like I saw even grants being changed to more social labor rights and so on, a little bit, not so much, but still, because but like I had this, but in Georgia, like we're sort of the periphery of all this. A lot of things haven't really changed here. So it depends on where we're looking. I just wanted to let you know about that because I thought that was an interesting. I would love for someone to write about these dynamics that happened in the early 2020s or right before 2020. This would have been very fascinating.
I just wanted for our listeners, if you could just define or how do you define neoliberalism? What is neoliberalism? And the reason is I want to talk about this is because there's so many sort of popular conceptions among the right, on the left, among liberals, among everybody about what neoliberalism is. But your book has a very in-depth study and meticulous breakdown of what neoliberalism is as an idea and what I would say is really existing neoliberalism. So for our audience, could you just define what is neoliberalism?
And I would add, and what's the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism? Because a lot of people don't know that.
Okay, so the book that I've written is primarily an intellectual history. And so what I was interested in was the ideas of neoliberal thinkers themselves. And what I mean by neoliberal thinkers is largely the people who were associated with the Mont Pelerin Society, which I previously mentioned, founded by Friedrich Hayek in 1947. And that was a project of reviving liberalism in a context where its practitioners felt besieged and marginalized in the context of the rise of socialism and social democracy and economic planning. And so they wanted to revive liberalism, but they believed that in order to do so, liberalism had to change. It had to abandon the sort of laissez-faire naturalism that they associated with 19th century liberalism, the idea that the market order could simply be left alone. And what needed to be done was that competition as an animating norm had to be deliberately installed in all areas of social life. So, on the one hand, instead of simply the idea of free trade, neoliberal thinkers posited the idea of competition, which rather than simply being a matter of freedom, they saw as a harsh discipline to which everybody had to submit and in which there would be winners and there would be losers. And they saw an extensive role for the state in enshrining competition and the market across, all kinds of realms of social and economic life. And the other thing that I would say about neoliberalism is that it was profoundly a moral project. So there's a vision that I try to challenge in the book that sees neoliberalism as all about this sort of rational Homo economicus, as being pure economics at the expense of morality and all things good in the world. And I was trying to argue, no, actually, there was a thick morality to neoliberal thinking. And this morality was profoundly racialized. It was about a defense of the superiority of so-called Western civilization, which neoliberal thinkers framed as the only civilization that had developed competitive market orders and whose practitioners were therefore more successful than other people. And it was also a moral order that drew on a sort of deep sort of conservative family values thinking in which the family was a central space of the organization of welfare and social reproduction. And so this moral agenda was very much central to what neoliberalism was. And so the thinkers that I was interested in really saw promoting a moral agenda, and in many cases, but not all, an explicitly Christian moral agenda as being the central complement of a market society. Someone like Hayek went as so far as to say that, faulty moral beliefs can destroy a civilization. And in his view, there was a moral battle that had to take place in his own time against those who defended norms of redistribution, for instance, and all of what he saw as collectivist ideas. And these needed to be combated if a civilization premised on competitive market relations was going to flourish. And that's where I think that human rights came in as that moral complement to the expansion of competitive market relations, particularly when we thought about that expansion in global terms.
Can you give us, because I found this really fascinating, can you give us some of the debates that were happening? Because you have parallel conferences, meetings happening. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I found so fascinating. The discussions between the different delegates. Maybe you can also discuss what the debates were about, like how some of the loopholes that were left in the discussions and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how that then supported a lot of sort of neoliberal ideas, especially about religion, which was amazing. And also my new villain, Malik, who you introduced to me first time about the Lebanese delegate. So maybe you can discuss some of these historical debates that were happening and how they kind of paralleled each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So I find the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights endlessly fascinating because it was a space where, over an extended period of time, almost 2 years, highly educated and political people from across the globe came together to debate what they saw as the foundations of a good society. So we think about who participated in those debates. The first thing to say is who didn't participate. And, you know, this was a period of formal colonial rule. Um, you know, half the world's people still lived in colonies and had no ability to participate in the drafting of this document of universal human rights. And the status of the euphemistically called non-self-governing territories was something that came up repeatedly in the context of the debates. So there was this enormous exclusion of much of the world. On the other hand, you did have delegates from the United States, from Europe, from the Soviet bloc. You had recently independent India. You had China sort of in the midst of its own revolution with a diplomat who ended up sort of with the existing regime. And there's the long story then of the People's Republic of China and its own fraught relationship with the UN. But you did have a delegate from Saudi Arabia. You had Charles Malik, the figure that you just mentioned, who was the Lebanese delegate, an Orthodox Christian who was one of the strongest defenders of the idea of Western civilization and the idea that this declaration had to embody the norms of what he called Western civilization, and particularly that it should draw on a very specific Christian natural law heritage. And so you had enormous disputes between all of these figures at the time. And there was quite a lot of opening there. And the declaration itself, it seems to me, is a document where there are huge openings for different kinds of political positions within it. There are a number of delegates who abstained when this came to the United Nations itself. Among those was the Soviet delegate. And it's very interesting. If you look at the speeches that were made then, one of the real sticking points was about how rights would actually be realized. So throughout the drafting process, the various delegates representing the Soviet bloc countries argued that it was all very well to write things down on a piece of paper, but unless material infrastructures were put in place for the realization of these rights, then they would remain simply pieces of paper. So they would say things like, what is the use of proclaiming a right to rest when people are forced to go to work in a capitalist society in order to survive? What's the use of declaring freedom of the press if people don't have paper and they don't have access to printing presses? So this was a very sort of practical idea of what was necessary to realize rights. And there were huge debates which took place there. It must be said that many of the neoliberal thinkers were quite horrified by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself. They saw it as succumbing to the organization thinking that saw people as members of an organization capable of granting rights, and particularly social and economic rights, and therefore of licensing forms of redistribution between people, which was something that they wanted to see prevented at all costs. So what we saw in the sort of period of human rights ascendancy was that a whole chunk of those rights in the Declaration were in many ways sort of left aside by new human rights NGOs, which focused very specifically on a sort of small section, largely of the civil rights and sort of to some extent of the political rights in the Declaration, and tended to neglect the question of social and economic rights. One thing that I should say, particularly because of where you are and the focus of this podcast, is that there's a sort of a standard version of the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says, the capitalist bloc pushed civil and political rights, the Soviet bloc pushed social and economic rights. And I've actually written a paper on this, which is separate from the book, to say that that picture is largely untrue, that actually the social and economic rights are in the Declaration largely because of various Latin American delegates who really pushed those rights. The significant contribution of the Soviet bloc was anti-discrimination. And what they came to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with was a commitment to an attempt to outlaw fascism and to outlaw racial discrimination and to embed strong norms against discrimination into this document, obviously at a time when the United States was practicing Jim Crow and did not want to talk about racial discrimination. And so while the Soviet bloc delegates made the arguments that I just spoke about the sort of the need for any declarations of social and economic rights to be backed up by actual material transformation to give people the resources to practice these rights, they essentially were largely disinterested in social and economic rights in the Declaration, precisely because they thought it's really utterly irrelevant in a capitalist society to write down that everyone has the right to work or the right to rest or the right to paid holidays. So as much as Hayek would later mock the Universal Declaration for saying that everybody has a right to paid holidays with leave, the Soviet bloc's delegates were just as mocking of the efficacy of writing those kind of things down on a piece of paper. And what they really thought a rights declaration could do was achieve assent amongst the victors of the Second World War and others that the forms of racial discrimination that were associated with fascism should be not allowed to return.
The thing I like the most about your book is that it's not simply just an intellectual history. It's a way where you take the ideologists and their ideas very seriously and then show how in the real world they were applied. And to me, this is the most important and useful aspect. Of course, being in Georgia, where there's this state that was built through the ideology of neoliberalism, very often people who oppose it do not know the basis of it. So, for example, in your book, when you're going through who the neoliberals were and then showing the context in, say, Pinochet's Chile, it's very, very useful. So, for our audience, could you just talk a little bit about this relationship between the ideology of, say, human rights and how it manifested probably in this most crude and clear example of a neoliberal regime, Pinochet's Chile, after Allende was overthrown in 1973? Because to me, that relationship between the neoliberals as ideologists and the really existing neoliberalism in Chile was so illuminating.
Yeah, thank you. And I should say that while before I said that the book is primarily an intellectual history, I was also very interested in the way that these ideas actually were taken up in practice. And so, yes, thank you for bringing me to that. So, I mean, there's been a lot of academic discussion of the influence of neoliberal thinkers, particularly Chicago School economists in Pinochet's Chile. And there's been less attention to the figures who were people like Hayek and Buchanan and figures who were particularly interested with sort of constitutional orders. But one of the principles, and you said that I take these sort of ideologists and neoliberal thinkers very, very seriously, and I did. And one of the things that I really tried to do in the book was not to simply dismiss their claims, but to ask if they really believed the things that they were saying, what is entailed by that? So, when Milton Friedman said that, the greatest threat to freedom was economic redistribution, or when Hayek said that he believed that freedom was greater in Chile under Pinochet than it was under Allende, you could just dismiss that and say that's absurd. This was a dictatorship which was torturing and disappearing people en masse because they were trade unionists or because they were leftists or because they were in other ways opponents of the regime. It's an absurdity to say that freedom was greater than it was under the regime of Allende. Or you could use that to ask, what does that mean freedom was for these people? And in doing that, it was very clear to me that freedom was essentially the freedom of capital, the freedom not to have your wealth interfered with, the freedom not to have to deal with a trade union that would tell you what you were or weren't allowed to pay your workers, that these were the freedoms that were centrally important to neoliberal thinkers. So people like Friedman, like Hayek, advised the Pinochet regime, met with Pinochet, and were really quite enthusiastic about his regime, referring to it as a miracle, for example. And really trying also, say, in the case of Hayek, I'll just go back. So Friedman, for instance, later tried to frame himself as simply a technocrat who simply gave, economic advice to the regime, but had nothing to do with all of that, other, unsavory human rights abuse type stuff. But really, even in his own speeches in Chile, he was absolutely adamant that political freedom and economic freedom are deeply imbricated, that there can be no political freedom in his own terms without the kind of economic freedom that would be unleashed by the type of shock therapy that he was advocating in Chile. So really for them, the political and the economic were deeply bound up together. And for Hayek also, this regime, he wrote to newspapers protesting what he saw as the unfair treatment by organizations like Amnesty International of Pinochet and his regime, arguing that actually this was possibly, a liberal regime, one somewhat lacking in liberalism, but far superior to a totalitarian regime, and that in fact far superior to what he called an unlimited democracy, which was the form of democracy that existed, for instance, in Western Europe at the time. So these figures were very willing to lend their support to really authoritarian and repressive policies, if not just because they thought that there was some kind of technocratic economic reforms that they would implement that would be useful, but because they shared a moral sensibility, which was about freeing humanity from collectivism, from demands for redistribution, and valorizing inequality.
Yeah, the concept of marginal freedom that you discuss, that you have the right to change jobs, but you don't have the right to form a union and ask for, higher wages. And this, just because you're born, you don't have rights. The market has to exist as the source of all your rights, was really well iterated. And I really enjoyed learning that because I think it's such a helpful way to understand how they think. But I really liked how you didn't talk about it so much, but you did allude to, you discussed Foucault, and this idea of market sovereignty and this everything that is intervening in the market is totalitarianism. But in some ways, how this was taken up by sort of postmodernist philosophers, in the sense that they also believed that this large remaking of man is a doomed project, that we should focus on these smaller, in the immediate utopias and not so large utopias, just anti-utopianism that is in the postmodernism, and how this sort of aligns with neoliberalism as the market is the most important thing, that anything outside of the market is totalitarianism, is doomed. And so maybe you can discuss how these two ideas of anti-utopianism and the immediacy of the market aligns with each other.
So just to return to that idea you mentioned of the margin of freedom, one of the things that's quite striking about most of the major neoliberal thinkers is that they reject the idea of natural rights. So take someone like Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian neoliberal thinker, and he was just utterly dismissive about the idea of natural rights. He said nature grants no rights at all. As you suggested, their position was that all our freedoms, all human freedoms, have come about because of market relations. They're all a product, in Mises' words, of the rise of capitalism. And it's the market which is the fundamental institution which makes other forms of freedom and all of our rights possible. And so, therefore, anyone who's interested in rights and freedom has to be concerned to defend the market order. That also means that compatibility or incompatibility with the competitive market order becomes the test by which all claims to rights are assessed. Are these claims compatible with a competitive market order, or would they undermine that market order? So if people are arguing for the right to housing, and they're arguing that that right to housing should be enabled through, for instance, rent control, that would be the sort of ultimate incompatible affirmation of rights, in the sense that this is incompatible with market competition in the housing market. And really, they had an almost hysterical idea of any sort of incompatible intervention into the market would set off this, cacophony and cascade of interventions which would destroy the whole market order, and with it all our rights, bring about a form of totalitarianism. On the other hand, rights that are compatible with the market order and perhaps even support market competition, many individual rights, for example, can be endorsed on that basis. So you have this real idea that there's this sort of margin of freedom that can be achieved in a market society, but any attempt to go beyond those margins risks totalitarianism. So obviously, any kind of grand scale political project that is utopian or that envisages overcoming market relations or, God forbid, capitalism would be inherently a totalitarian project, and one which had to be prevented in the interests of human freedom and rights for neoliberal thinkers. Now, in the book, I'm interested in the influence that these kinds of ideas had on human rights NGOs, but obviously they were influential more broadly. And as you mentioned, there are many resonances between sort of French theory of the 70s and 80s, particularly, and many of the ideas of neoliberal thinkers. I mean, in relation to Foucault, I think he's an interesting figure. He was certainly one of the most prescient analysts of neoliberal thinking, even if aspects of his own thought certainly merged with key concerns of neoliberal thinkers of that period. But it's very interesting in some of his lectures, he talks about what he terms the state phobia of neoliberalism, and argues that there's this tendency to associate every sort of social welfare measure with death camps, and is actually quite critical by that point of this sort of neoliberal road to serfdom type idea that, in its sort of almost parodic form by Ludwig von Mises, he says, you start off with a government that just wants to give free milk to children, and step by step, socialism on the model of the Nazis inevitably arises. You just think, what, milk? Nazism, really? So Foucault also analysed that kind of idea, but I certainly agree that the sort of critiques of totality and transparency and planning that were very in fashion in the academy in the sort of 80s and 90s owed much to neoliberal thinking of the period.
And also with the charges of totalitarianism, any kind of collective action, you also mentioned the racial components of this, or Slavs aren't not white, but the fact that they're considered backward,
Yeah,
this idea that everything east of Austro-Hungary is just like savages. And
absolutely.
so so maybe you can talk about how the idea of socialism, communism is looked up as a tribalist,
Yeah,
anachronistic society and not the future. And any kind of anachronism, any kind of backwardness should be combated alongside totalitarianism, as in also backwardness at the same time. Yet the market was the sophisticated, the future, the appropriate form of society for the today's time. Maybe you can discuss that because I thought that was, and also like you also mentioned, Muslims were considered the same similar ways and very distrusted. You can talk about that.
yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the really important things, I think, in thinking about neoliberalism of the 20th century, just how deeply racialized neoliberal thinking was, how animated by racial hierarchies and civilizational hierarchies, and how the market for neoliberal thinkers was a distinctive achievement of Western civilization. So to take Hayek, because I think he gives one of the most sort of articulated accounts of this kind of argument, he has a civilizational narrative, in a sense, borrowing from the Scottish Enlightenment and figures like Adam Ferguson, for instance, who have a sort of stadial account of the stages of civilization. But for Hayek, it was very interesting in looking at his own time of demands for socialism and social democracy. He argued that what he was seeing was what he called sort of a return to repressed primordial instincts. So, according to his civilizational narrative, humanity was originally collectivist, that humans lived in sort of what he called the small band or tribal societies for much of our existence. And so, actually, in a really interesting sense for Hayek, human nature is collectivist. We desire to be with other people. We want to share. We want to work together. We want to redistribute resources. And if we're not subjected to the strict discipline of the market, we will continuously slip back into these sort of regressive collectivist patterns because it's in this sort of ingrained into our nature to desire these sort of more egalitarian social norms. And so when neoliberal thinkers looked around the world, they associated really everyone outside of Europe with these sort of barbarian, civilizational regressions that only the Europeans had successfully demonstrated a proficiency for social collaboration through an extensive division of labor. And that meant that they were more successful than others, but they were always threatened by these less successful, less advanced peoples who would try to undermine the market order. And there was always the risk of slipping back, even for those societies that had succeeded in achieving these market orders. So there was this sort of racialized argument about the Soviet Union. Mises, for instance, talks about how, well, whatever we think of European fascism, it's not so bad because it emerged amongst highly civilized people. So it will only ever be this sort of, blip. Whereas, communism emerged amongst sort of barbarous peoples and is therefore this sort of civilizational threat as well as being an economic and political threat. So you get that kind of language and rhetoric all through the neoliberal thinkers. And yes, often this very curious association between Islam and communism as these sort of fanatical projects that threaten the sort of rational market civilization of the West.
There was this great discussion. There's a Libertarian Party in Georgia, and they had which are just like classic neoliberals, and they had another conservative right winger, and they were discussing in the EU because there's a big debates around EU in Georgia. Well, actually, not debates. There should be more debates, but so the libertarian guy's like, I'm against regulation. I'm against this. I'm against that. Any kind of constraint to the market that from the EU, which is very few constraints, but still. And the conservative right winger asks him like, why do you want the EU if you're against all of these regulations? And he said, because it's the Western civilization. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's like this civilizational part in Georgia is so dominant. Why they want to be part of Europe. It's not even that they don't even care what the content is, as long as they get to be part of the Western civilization. Everything is a civilizational discourse. They think of this as normal, and they're always fighting against the Soviet mentality, which is the regular human nature, which is collectivist in general. They distrust workers. They hate them. Even now, miners are losing their jobs. Like 3,500 miners may be losing their jobs, or because the mine is closing down. And sort of a lot of the liberal opposition were mocking them. It's like, oh, these people, like they're backward. They are not to be trusted as like the disciplined market guy that will make sure that they do not interfere in their market and keep the civilization going. And so a lot of these discussions, even though you talk about the book, like one thing that Soviets tried to bring, and also other delegates, was to make sure to remove the civilization discourse, yet neoliberals put it back in. This is a fascinating part, which means that the continuation of the Western civilization discourse, the Western civilization aspiration, is really it is malevolent, like the way it's being fested in all of the human rights parts in Georgia and the NGOs, and a lot of the liberals that are very much pro NGOs, is it means to constantly refer to everyone as regressive, they're Soviet regressive, need to be disciplined, and there's no hope for these people at all, and not even an attempt to integrate them, into society, because they can't be changed. So maybe you can discuss more about this, the Western civilizational part, and also you already mentioned this, but maybe the fact that they were really ambivalent towards Nazism. They're like, yeah, like you said, it's a Western civilization moment, so it can't be that bad. Maybe you can discuss more of that.
Sure, yes. So I think it's an interesting point of interaction between neoliberal thinkers and the Human Rights Project, because, as you just mentioned, this language of civilization was one where the Soviet bloc delegates were responsible for having that language excluded from the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They said this is an anachronism belonging to the age of the Tsars. It has no place in this modern human rights declaration. So from that perspective, from the mid-20th century and seen from the Soviet Union, it was the idea of civilization and the idea of a standard of civilization that was the anachronism. And that was what was the sort of regressive norm that should be discarded on the path towards some kind of universal humanity. Now, we all know that the universalism of human rights was never so universal, that it was always hierarchical, and that racial hierarchies always played a central role in whose human rights were defended and whose were not defended. But on the neoliberal side, you saw the overt embrace of that language of civilization, and that idea that there was this way of being in the West, and that human rights were the legacy of something called the West. Again, deeply anachronistic way of uniting the history of ancient Greece and Rome and medieval Christianity and a sort of a hodgepodge of sources into something called the West. But they were very emphatic that there was this civilizational superiority, and that a central feature of that civilizational superiority was capitalism, and specifically competitive market relations, a way of knitting together social relations through the market rather than in a political form. And so that civilizational hierarchy was very central to neoliberal thinking of that period.
I just want to make one comment that to me, this part of the book about empire, colonialism, and imperialism as being something which could not be divorced from the ideology of neoliberalism because it's like an inherent component of it, the vanguard of Western civilization. You guys already discussed it very well, but to me, this was the most illuminating because how blunt some of these neoliberal thinkers were in their racialist, hierarchical assumption of how the natural order of things would be. So, in a sense, just like an extension of the conservative imperial Western civilizational structure being reformulated as kind of this progressive new economic ideology of modernization in a period to defend against this kind of collectivist, barbaristic threat. So to me, this was very fascinating.
Thank you. And maybe I should say something more about the colonialism and decolonization aspect, because we've talked about the sort of civilizational ideas, but I haven't really talked about how they responded to decolonization.
With that, I think you will mention it yourself, is like the fact that the reparations or any kind of, correcting the justice of colonialism was, banned. You can't do that. And so, and I would like to ask maybe, does neoliberalism in the end accept different races into its project, even though they'll never be able to catch up to white people? Or like, I would like to have more clarity on that.
This reparations thing was something I was thinking about in the colonialism part, which was also that it struck me very interesting. One of the themes of our podcast, of course, is history. It's not the only thing, but it's a major theme. We talk about history a lot, how history is done, was that the neoliberals had this like anti-historical view of the world while simultaneously, of course, relying on a historical form to justify their neoliberalism, In the same way, you could say that they were anti the intervention of the state while every aspect of their ideology required this kind of aggressive autocratic state. But in the realm of imperialism, race, and colonialism, they made these arguments about how the past was the past and could not be something which could either be undone through reparations, like Sopo mentioned, or was not even something worth interacting with because it simply was the past and had no bearing on the future. As opposed to something which, of course, the left has historically must be sort of reconciled, overcome in a way to build a new future.
In terms of their understanding of colonialism, one of the things that I think is really important to understanding neoliberalism is that while there was a sort of a project of ideological self-clarification that happened in neoliberal circles, and particularly in the Mont Pelerin Society over, a couple of decades from its founding in 1947, the point at which I think neoliberalism really becomes animated as a global project is in reaction to decolonization. And the real fear of neoliberal thinkers was that decolonization would lead to not only a transformation of formal sovereignty in former colonies, but a transformation of economic relations and potentially a transformation and an overthrowing of the colonial division of labor. So many of the efforts of neoliberal thinkers of the period of decolonization went into attempting to conceptualize how the norms of colonialism could be re-embedded in conditions of formal equality and formal sovereignty. So I say in the book that what Kwame Nkrumah talked about as neocolonialism was for the neoliberals a project. So what you see is that they respond in different and interesting ways to decolonization. So after the Bandung conference in Indonesia, you had some neoliberal thinkers, like Alexander Rusto, became quite excited and said, this is an opportunity to free decolonization from communism and for us to align ourselves with those people in the colonies who want to achieve independence and ensure that they do so on liberal terms. And, many of the demands of the Bandung Conference were actually fairly compatible with a sort of market order. They wanted more foreign investment, for example. This was not yet the more radical projects that came to animate much thinking about decolonization later. But many of the neoliberals were just immediately horrified and believed that the people of the former colonies would inevitably bring about totalitarian regimes. Some of this they blamed on the late British Empire and on the sort of social democratic and planning norms that were in vogue in Britain itself in the late period of the British Empire. And they argued that the people of the former colonies had sort of been given this poisonous legacy by the British Empire in particular. But they were terrified about what they saw as the threat of totalitarianism, which primarily meant the threat of state intervention into the economy, and particularly the expropriation of foreign multinational corporations. So they went about constructing the norms and the legal orders to attempt to ensure that the people of the former colonies and the new independent leaders of former colonies were locked into colonial relationships, whether that was repayment of debt obligations or requirements to maintain the production of cash crops or primary materials. So they were very opposed to attempts within former colonies to transform the international division of labor, the kind of things that were formalized in the new international economic order in the mid-1970s. And they really went about trying to undermine that project, which was a project on one hand of international redistribution and forms of reparation for colonialism, but also an attempt to transform the terms of trade and to enable former colonies to develop their economies so they would not simply be exporters of cash crops to wealthier countries. And so this was the point where neoliberals really organized against third worldism and what were at the time called the sort of third world states, and where they really found common cause with neoliberals in doing so. And I write in the book particularly about Médecins Sans Frontières and how the French organization formed a think tank called Liberté Sans Frontières, aimed at combating third worldism in the development sector, and really went to war, metaphorically, against arguments about structural inequality, demands for economic redistribution, and tried to shift emphasis onto the human rights violations of third world states at the expense of discussion of structural economic inequalities that were the legacy of colonial rule.
Actually, just sort of contemporary, I thought of you when I was looking at the debates between like the mega civil war that was happening with I think Ramaswamy wrote that the Indians are like much more sort of morally ready for the market. Like they have, they don't have fun or whatever. They just study all the time. They're good little workers. And I found this interesting because it seems like a certain, elite ruling class believes that the US has now really failed in having these disciplined workers in the US, and they're looking for other cultures or other people who are much more uh, ready, disciplined for the market. And I found this like interesting in the sense that there's this, the MAGA has like the two different wings, right? One is that says like Americans, like we should actually focus on rebuilding them. And then the other one, who's much more of the capitalist wing, like Elon Musk and Maswami, who are like, we don't care about America. We're just going to import whoever is not going to ruin the market, like make sure that they're not asking for, unions or all this healthcare. They're just going to work nonstop, and not really committed to saving America for the people, but actually just saving the concept by importing workers or only focusing on the part of the workers in the US that are good for them. And so this moral part, maybe you can discuss a little bit more about what you mean by the moral framework, like end it on that maybe, of neoliberalism being a philosophy that, and I do look at it as a philosophy now. It's like a bunch of philosophers got together, thought of this, and then now it seems like neoliberalism, some really high, sort of data-driven, economic system or something. But they're just these kind of old, very racist, hierarchical, lovers of empire who came up with this really, more horrific version of liberalism. And how this plays out now, and what do you really mean by what does it look like to have a moral framework? Because I think the indoctrination part of human, like also using human rights, but also the indoctrination part of every level where you're training and like socially engineering people because they might slip into their old natural ways. That has been something that's I've taken from your book much more seriously. And then maybe you can discuss that.
I think when I think about the moral framework of neoliberalism, the norm that is fundamental to many of them, I think, is submission. It's Hayek who states this very explicitly, the need for submission to the incomprehensible order of the market. But I think that it's very much there through neoliberal thinking as a whole, that we need to be prepared to, on the one hand, individually work on ourselves and transform ourselves and discipline ourselves because the economic conditions that we find around us are like facts of nature that we have to adapt ourselves to. And market competition is similarly a norm that should be treated as if it's a law of nature. And we need to position ourselves to win within those existing laws rather than imagining that we could challenge them along with others or transform them. Now, I think today we're seeing really fundamental transformations in global economic power, political power. The Trump administration is obviously profoundly transformative, but also profoundly unstable. And there are numerous different strands within that project, and we will see how much they fit together. I mean, the kind of global subjection to the discipline of the market is the idea that justified the offshoring of industrial work from the United States that Trump is now railing against and claiming to bring back. You see people like Marco Rubio, who has his office a little while back put out this report on the state of the working and non-working man in the United States, which is, on the one hand, a profound indictment of the state of US society and deindustrialization. On the other, this profoundly conservative social vision about male power. But you see this vision playing out, as you say, with sort of forms of techno-libertarianism, and with deeply capitalist visions that owe enormous amounts to the more radical and libertarian wings of neoliberalism. So I think we're yet to see how these things will play out. One thing that I think it is not too early to say is that the moral order of globalized human rights that I talk about in the book is over. And I think that that order, as the complement of a globalizing market society, has been exhausted by the contradictions of that society, by its failures, and also by the successes of marginalized groups and of other countries to insert themselves into the language of this supposed universalism and tried to do what Jacques Rancière talks about as verifying equality. If we're all equal, then why not us? If all people are supposedly equal, then why should the United States be able to determine foreign policy for the globe, for example? So I think some of the successes in pushing the limits of the universalism of that previous moral order have led to the United States essentially rescinding the promise, the never fulfilled promise of the universalism that underpinned this moral order in the first place. And I think we can't see that just as a Trump phenomenon. We saw it in the previous Trump administration, but it was very much pushed forward by the Biden administration, who, started talking constantly about the rules-based international order, an idea that went back to Obama and has a sort of nebulous and unclear relationship to something a little bit less nebulous called international law. But the rules-based international order seemed to be whatever the US and their allies decided the rules were at any given moment. And you saw an attempt to back away from those institutions which actually had some kind of universal assent amongst states, whether that was the United Nations or the World Trade Organization. And you saw the rise of a more sort of friend versus enemy style of international politics that I think Trump is now taking to sort of more extreme lengths at the same time as scrambling some of those understandings of who constitutes a friend and who constitutes an enemy. So I think we're in a very unstable time, but one where much of this moral order, the morals of the market, is really being profoundly undermined.
I find, and you reference this a little bit. Samuel Moyn references a little bit more with liberalism against itself. But I find the most interesting is how really indictment of neoliberalism is that they never really forced Israel to take on any of these kinds of what they forced like former colonies to take on with this human rights and protecting investors and so on. They never did this with Israel. They let them have a state. They let them have welfare. They had government intervention, government, in building the market and so on. So because they wanted Israel to actually succeed, therefore they never actually forced any of this neoliberalism on until like after it was already developed and so on. And so maybe you can end on with this whole understanding of rule-based order and how every other country had to abide by this global neoliberalism. There was one exception as usual, which was Israel.
Well, look, I mean, Israel certainly went through its own period of neoliberalization, but I think interestingly in the context of human rights, I mean, it's a truism that, the US has been prepared to put up its hand and veto, numerous successive resolutions that have attempted to hold Israel to the standards that other states are supposed to be held to. Now, we know that human rights have never been universally upheld, and Israel is a particularly glaring example of that. But I think that we've witnessed something distinct from that in the context of Israel's genocide in Gaza. And that is not just a failure to uphold the norms, but a failure even to espouse the norms. I think we've seen a profound backing away from ideas of human equality, from ideas of universalism where we're supposed to treat all people as equal. And I think Trump's latest almost parodic plans to, build a Riviera on the sea in Gaza, expel its people, and, circulating AI videos of he and Netanyahu sipping cocktails with their shirts off on the beach, it sort of takes that to an extreme length. But I think that one thing we saw quite clearly from Israeli leaders is that they were absolutely uninterested in really making claims about universal human rights and very willing to make simple assertions of racial superiority as the basis for their conduct. And I think that we're really seeing a different stage when the norms are not just violated and hypocritically upheld, but are actually disparaged. And I think that the more recent demands to, destroy the United Nations, when the when Israel's United Nations representative went on camera and said that the UN offices in New York ought to be demolished, that seemed to me to be a pretty profound break with the previous order, in which these rules were sort of where there was lip service played to the rules and institutions of international organization, and yet they were, of course, dishonored in practice. I think we're seeing something quite distinct here, and I don't think that the existing order of human rights and the post-19, the Second World War, post-Second World War international order will survive.
როცა ყველა გძულს მე არ მჯერა რომ შიში შექმს სიყვარულს სიმართლე რომ სინათლეა ყოველთვის ამბობ მაგრამ მას თავს ყოველთვის არ ანდობ სიმართლე მაშინ გიყვარს როცა შენთანაა როცა სხვა მართალი მაშინ მთელი ქვეყანა მცდარი გეტყვი ჩვარი ხარ სიმართლის წარმოუდგ მატერიალი ღრიალი დაზეპირებული ფრაზის მერე უბრალო გაცხოვა ზურგზე ასისია ქართველი ყველაზე ნიჭიერი მაგრამ ზარმაცია შეფეცინე იმ ნიჭის ხალხს რომ არ ადგება რა მნიშვნელობა აქვს ვინ მოვა და ვინ გადადგება პრობლემა ჩვენშია ან რა შუაშია ქსელი საზოგადოებაში გამეფებულა ბნელი ხედავ ქარმა უკვე მიატოვა ქართაველი არა და ჯერ კიდევ შორი გზა გვაქვს გასავლელი სანამონური მენტალობა წარსულსა ჩავაბარეთ ჩვენი უძრაობა სხვა სულ გადავაბრალეთ აზროვნების შიში გაქვს ვაი და ყველაფერს მიხვდე და გენგრეს გოდოლი და რეალობას ჩაუფიქრდე ვაი თუ დაინახო თავის შავ-თეთრ კონტურებში და მერე მოხუცივით ძამში მოიხარო მხრებში სილაში თავის ჩარგვა იცი რომ არ გიშველის იქნებ მაინც კეცა და ფიქრი დაგანწრევა ხელის ისე ნუ გამიგებ თითქოს თავს უკეთესად ვთვლიდე მეც ვიბრძვი და მინდა სიბნელიდან გამოვიდე მეც მინდა ქუჩაში ვიღაც მტერივით არ მიყურებდეს და მერე დაბოღმილი თავზე შარს არ ეძებდეს არ გიცნო მაგრამ მინდა შენ ციხი მოდი ან მივესალმო ბავშვებს სკოლიდან რომ მოდიან მემსახურები ხელოვნებას ურბანულ პოეზიას სიტყვა გამიგრძელდა მაგრამ კარს ტოვებ ღიას თუ ჩემი გესმის იცოდე მარტო არ ხარ და თუნდაც უცხო ხარ მე შენ მიყვარ ხარ როცა ჩავამსე და დაიშლებით სახლებში მე გამოვა ქუჩაში და სიჩუმეს მოვსმე როცა ჩავამსე და დაიშლებით სახლებში მე გამოვა ქუჩაში და სიჩუმეს მოვსმე როცა ჩავამსე მე გამოვა ქუჩაში და სიჩუმეს მოვსმე როცა ჩავამსე და დაიშლებით სახლებში მე გამოვა ქუჩაში და სიჩუმეს მოვსმე